Welcome, business podcasters, to another episode of Podcasting and Professional Services. If this is your first time here, this podcast features stories of experts and professional service providers who have created a business impact through the power of podcasting. I'm your host, John Tyerman, and if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, leave a rating and review. Today's episode features Mark Amtower, host of Amtower Off Center, which is a radio show and podcast for government contractors. Mark has had an extensive career pushing the envelope of marketing and communications in the government contracting space, from direct mail in the 80s to email in the 90s to radio and podcasting in the early 2000s. We talked about his journey getting into radio, the impact of podcasting on his career. We talked about a few tips on how to do LinkedIn more effectively and much, much more. But before we get to my conversation with Mark, imagine you're able to build trust with more buyers. Imagine you're able to accelerate your network growth more rapidly and create endless marketing content, all from one activity. Well, that's the power of podcasting. So if you're ready to explore the idea of launching a podcast for your business, I'm offering a free podcast consultation. Simply go to redcedarmarketing.com or send me a message on LinkedIn to get in touch. All right, and now for my conversation with Mark. Today, my guest is Mark Amtower, the preeminent GovCon marketing and LinkedIn advisor, speaker, coach, author, and host of the Amtower Off Center radio show and podcast. Welcome to the show, Mark.
John, happy to be here, man. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had a couple of podcast conversations in the past, I believe. I think it was like 5 years ago.
At least, yeah. Yeah, they were fun.
Yeah. I think it was Lee Fredrickson, Kelly Waffle, you and myself. We had a great conversation around your journey to becoming a visible expert in the government contracting space. So for folks that are listening to this, go check out that interview with Mark on the Visible Expert podcast. But Mark, for our conversation today, what I'd love to do is just quickly kind of establish a timeline of your career, just to get our audience up to speed. I think that there's a couple bullet points that I'd like to point out. Like, for example, in the 80s, you built your business building and selling targeted mailing lists of key government employees. And then in the 90s, you launched a weekly e-newsletter. And then in the early 2000s, you published books, ebooks, and audio programs through the government market press. So throughout your career, you've been publishing content, adapting to new communications channels. And then in 2006, I saw you moved your radio program from Annapolis to DC. And I'd love to kind of use this as a jumping off point. I'm curious, when did you first get into broadcasting?
I went to something called the National Publicity Summit that the Harrison brothers, Steve and Bill, put on. And I went a couple of different times, and there were several radio programs represented there, so you could become a guest on their shows. And I was a guest on, between 2005 and 2007, I was probably on 20 different shows as a guest.
Okay.
And I liked it. I liked it a lot. And I thought, maybe I could do this. So I went to WBIS in Annapolis, and that was a pay for play situation. So I needed some experience. So I paid, I went there weekly. I actually was on air in Annapolis, but, in order to listen to it, you needed a steel plate in your head because the signal was about 5 watts. But it was weird because literally about a year later, WTOP, which is the parent to Federal News Radio, the head of the station, Joel Oxley, was having lunch with some government contractors, one of which was Mark Moit, who was then with PRC, I think. I forget who he was with. He was with a big systems integrator. And he said, your show, Federal News Network, Federal News Radio, was all about federal employee stuff, 24 hours a day, right? And a lot of repeat. He said, you need a show for government contractors, and you need Amtower to do it. They contacted me. I started there in February '07, and I've been there ever since. It's not my day job, but it is fun, and I get to, one of the cool things about being a host is you get to access people that you might not otherwise get to access too easily.
Yep.
Hey, you want to be on my show? I'm on Federal News Network. Yeah.
That's one of the things that I've noticed too, is with a podcast, it's, the people that you wouldn't normally be able to have a conversation with, they say yes because of the platform and because of the ability for them to reach a wider audience than just having a one-to-one conversation. So yeah, I've definitely experienced that too. And Mark, I'd love to kind of dive into just your perspective on, you've seen a lot of change in the way businesses adopt technology to support marketing and new business development. Like, for example, you started with mailing lists, and then you got into email, and then radio and broadcasting and LinkedIn. We've seen many channels come and go. Like, yeah, I think Facebook's dying. I think LinkedIn is at a critical juncture right now. Email and podcasts, in my opinion, are like the two oldest, and they're poised to kind of stand the test of time. Can you talk about your decision, or maybe it was a joint decision with the Federal News Network? You moved your show onto an RSS feed in 2018 to be on a podcast. Was that decision made by the Federal News Network? Did you have any input on that? Can you walk me through that?
I had no idea it was actually happening. And I'm not aware that it impacted anything because my show's always been downloadable. So you could go to the station website and listen to it anytime. You didn't have to be there, whenever it was airing, because I've aired it a couple of different times on the studio. So it's always, I guess, technically been a podcast. But no, on the back end, I had no clue.
Interesting.
And, I don't know what year it happened. I always thought of it as a radio show, and people started saying, "Hey, I love your podcast." And I'm going, really?
Well, I think what's cool about that is, a radio show has a limited geographic reach, and then a podcast has, more broad national, if not global, reach to it. So you could reach a much, much larger audience. Did you notice, when folks started reaching out to you and saying, "Hey, I love your podcast," were they out of market? Were they still in market? Like, did you notice that kind of geographic effect?
There was some of that I noticed, but when I started the show, I mean, this strange timeline, right? So LinkedIn started in 2003. I joined in 2004. I got on the radio 2007. I still wasn't using LinkedIn very well in 2007 because there weren't that many people there. It wasn't until like 2010 when more people started getting on LinkedIn. And I started hearing from a lot of people on LinkedIn then about the show. To your point, they were everywhere.
Okay. And so the professional nature of LinkedIn and the fact that that was more of a professional social networking platform, combined with the fact that you were very early in adopting podcasting as a medium, I think that kind of that just creates like this perfect storm of you were in the right place on the right platform at the right time.
I was a very lucky person to have been invited to come to Federal News Radio, now Federal News Network. I had already developed a pretty strong reputation in the market by that time, which is why it happened. So, but still, it was a matter of luck that my friend Mark Moit told Joel Oxley that he needed this show and he needed Amtower to do it.
I don't know that it was luck though, Mark, because and that's kind of why I was like looking back at the timeline, and you have always been on the forefront of marketing, innovation, and technology, and you were publishing an e-newsletter in '96, right?
Actually, as soon as Netscape came out, I had to convert the hard copy to
email. Right.
Well, yeah, and that saved me a lot of money too.
Sure. Yeah. Oh gosh, I'm sure. I think like my point is that you were already kind of pushing the envelope in terms of like new communication channels, and so I think it was that maybe can you speak to the importance of kind of pushing that envelope and being flexible and adaptive to changes in how you go to market?
Right. Well, you and I are marketing people, and we have to be aware of the new channels as they emerge. And in the government market, we are rarely an adopt early kind of ecosystem
Yeah.
for a lot of things, particularly marketing things. But being on the forefront there when they start to emerge into the GovCon community is important to, you know, the Lee Fredericksons and Mark Amtowers of the world. Now, Liz Haar and Austin, all of those guys. But yeah, you have to be there. And I was fortunate to have, by that time I had a great network, and people would say, hey, have you looked at this? Hey, have you looked at that? So 2 years or so ago, people were saying, hey, Mark, are you going to join Clubhouse, which was a supposedly business social network? And I said, no. And they said, why? And I said, because nobody's there yet. And, inviting key people to go there doesn't mean traffic's going to occur. I'm going to stay where the traffic is until such time as, it's necessary to migrate. And as it turns out, I don't even know if Clubhouse exists anymore. So I'm glad I didn't venture there.
Yeah, I think it still exists. I don't think that it is nearly as popular as we were led to believe it would be when it first came out. But yeah, it just didn't seem like a good fit at the time too, because you had podcasts and you had radio already, and so why it just didn't make any sense at the time.
No, it didn't. So, but to your point, the podcast. I'm not the youngest guy on the block, so I know a lot of people who have retired over the last X number of years, and a lot of them contact me when they're vacating the premise and say, "Hey, I've really appreciated, your articles in Wash Tech, your podcast, your books, whatever." And I'm thinking to myself, well, why the hell didn't you tell me then so we could talk about it? You could have given me ideas. So it seems to be somewhat pervasive.
So who are some of the guests, like if you were like looking back on the years and thinking through maybe some of the moments in studio, or I don't know if you did interviews or many remote interviews, but maybe are there some stories or times that really stand out in your memory as ones that you reflect back on and think about?
I think my favorite interviews have been either with other marketing professionals in the market or authors. So Anne Hanley was a guest on my show a long time ago when her first book came out. The one she wrote with C.C. Chapman. Now I can't remember what it's called. And
Everybody Writes?
No, Everybody Writes was second. Well, anyway, Anne Hanley. Everybody who writes knows Anne Hanley.
Yeah.
But, I had her on. She actually did, I don't know if it's just live or not, she actually did a blurb for my Selling to the Government book in 2010. I had David Meerman Scott on, the author of The New Rules of Marketing and PR. David had been on my show a couple of times remotely, and when he came to DC, we always recorded another show. So authors have been fun. The founder of HubSpot was on the show. Yep. Now I can't remember his name. Where's his book? Brian Halligan.
Brian Halligan.
Those are fun because, like we were talking about earlier, these are people that I might not normally otherwise get to talk to. So it's always, I have hard copy books, as you can see. I don't know if your guests can see, all over the place. I don't like to read ebooks, even though I've written one out of 9 is an ebook.
1 out of the 9 books you wrote is an ebook?
Yeah.
There you go.
It's okay. The only one I wrote on LinkedIn too.
Well, if the shoe fits, that audience is, digitally savvy, I suppose. So yeah, it makes sense there.
And I did it for a friend of mine. I hadn't planned on writing one. Mitchell Levy calls and says, I'm doing these books And this is cool. You'll like this. Back when Twitter was 140 or 144 characters, whatever it was, he said, I want you to do LinkedIn power tips, 140 of them in 140 characters or less, so they're all tweetable.
Did you do it?
I did.
Oh, there you go. Well, folks that are listening to this, they don't see your bookshelf, but if folks are watching this on YouTube, they absolutely do. LinkedIn, your business it's a big part of how you consult with government contractors. Can you give us a little kind of taste of how you support government contractors on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I do a lot of training programs for contractors on LinkedIn around, how your profile should look, number one, so you can attract all of the attention in the world. But if your profile sucks, people aren't going to hang around. Okay. So it starts with a profile, then, developing a connection philosophy. Who do you actually want in your network? Both incoming and outgoing requests. So, and then teaching people how to reach out to people, because you don't want to just send the form letter. You really need to put it in context if you want to get their attention. You want to personalize it. So that's a big part. Then the whole social selling engagement factor. There's 1,001 ways at least to engage on LinkedIn. Maybe that's my next tweetable book, except I'm not going to support that platform. But, and so many people just reach out cold, and you don't have to on LinkedIn. There's a lot of ways to create warm. If you want to reach out to somebody who actually influences in our market, look at their profile, look at their posts, repost something, and say something germane. If you see them speak somewhere, tag it. Tag the event and tag the person. There's just a lot of ways to get on their radar, so you're now warm when you reach out. But when you reach out, again, it's got to be in context. So, and it's weird. The platform is now over 20 years old, and everybody's there. But my guess is that only about 25% of the GovCons contractors out there use it to anywhere near capacity.
Totally agree.
And most of them are just there, and occasionally they'll post, and they just assume that because they're there, people will find them.
Well, and then what they post is, we are so excited to announce this new bid, or we're so excited to announce this new project. And, why should your buyers really care about that? I think you bring up a few really good points. Number one, the sales cycles in government contracting are so long. So it's not like you can go out and prospect, and it's a numbers game where you're going to get one yes for every 40 no's, right? This is a game where, like you said, it's about building trust and developing relationships and engaging over time. And so that needs to be really thoughtful and intentional and relationship based. And you really need to kind of do your research and understand who to reach out to. And I think that's, LinkedIn is the vehicle for that, but there's a lot that goes into kind of the front end and the strategy behind it.
Yep. Yeah. So this is going to come out our interview is going to come out in November. So probably a month after this interview, I will have the updated version of my annual census on LinkedIn, the census of feds on LinkedIn. And so far this year, I'm tracking about 2.9 million feds, and I've identified over 700 company pages for federal departments, agencies, operating divisions, offices, special units. They're just everywhere. And the cool thing about that is, if you're focusing on a particular niche, they may have a company page, and that company page will identify the key people that you need to reach out to. Now you know who they are. Now you have to map out a way to get their attention without seeming to just want to sell.
And you don't need LinkedIn Sales Navigator to do this. This is something that where you can go On the free version of LinkedIn, you can go to a company page, and I think it's, you scroll down to people under the company page, and then you're able to see all the people that work in the organization. That's a really great kind of first step to doing that research and understanding who to reach out to.
Yeah, they're there.
And so for folks that are listening to this, Mark, I think if you're in the government contracting space, then yeah, you should absolutely check out Mark's, what did you call it? The federal census on LinkedIn?
Yeah. Yeah. I actually sell the census for $195. So you get all 700 plus links.
So if you want to shortcut your research, check out Mark's research report.
Yeah. Yeah. I have it in my posts. So it's pretty easy to find. If you don't see it, just, email me on LinkedIn.
Very cool. So Mark, I want to get back to your podcast.
Sure.
And your radio show, Amtower Off Center. Where do you plan to take the show from here? What's next for your radio show? What's next for the podcast? What are some of the grand designs for the rest of this year and then into next?
It's an election year, so depending on the outcome of the election, I'm probably going to bring in some people to talk about how government is going to be, similar or dissimilar, where the money's going to be spent. Both Harris and Trump have different ideas on where to spend money. So those are important. Which contractual vehicles are coming into play, and will they still be coming into play? So I think the biggest one will be, where do we go from here? And I need to identify the right people to talk to about that.
I suppose you're right. Yeah, that the impact of the election would have a major impact on a lot of government contractors at the market. So I suppose that this is an important year for your radio show and your podcast to be able to, take that larger context and then kind of unpack it and help government contractors understand what it means.
Yeah. And, I don't have a crystal ball, but I know several people would do. So
there you go. And they could be guests on your show, right?
Exactly. Those are the ones that I want. So I'll start queuing them up. So, by the time our show airs, I will be interviewing those people as well. It's election years are very important. Feds migrate. They migrate internally and some migrate externally.
What do you mean by that? They migrate?
They go from agency to agency. I mean, if you're on a career path in the government and the people immediately above you aren't going to be moving on anytime soon, you're looking to other departments or other offices in your agency where you can go and move up, or to other agencies where there's a better chance of moving up.
I see.
If you're stuck at a GS 12, 13, or 14, and you really want to get to that 15 level, and the person above you is, 15 years and they ain't moving for another 10, you got to go. So, and I track those on LinkedIn as much as I can, because there's a lot of people out there. I'm not tracking all 3 million of them. But, as far as the show goes, I have no plans on vacating Federal News Network. They've been, most gracious with me, having me there for the past 17 plus years, and I'm going to stay. I'll stay as long as they want me.
There you go. Well, I think, they'll probably want you to stick around, especially, with the outcome of this election, whichever way it goes. So, Mark, if there was a younger business expert, government contractor, and he or she is thinking about launching a podcast, getting into radio broadcasting as a vehicle for their business and marketing their business, what kind of advice would you give someone who's just starting their career in radio or broadcasting?
Number one, make sure that you know how to ask a question and then shut up and let the person answer. Serious biz, when I started on Federal News Radio, I needed a lot of coaching. And the program director, Letha Wolf, was extremely kind and very patient with me. And apparently I've evolved into a fairly decent host. I don't like listening to me, but a lot of other people seem to. It is what it is. But if you're going to go out there and try to start something, talk to a lot of people who have done it. A lot of podcast hosts like yourself, John, are willing to talk to people about this. If you can find a studio that exists and work with them to launch it. So you have the equipment, you have the people who have the ability to get it on Podcast One, Apple, all of the other platforms, even YouTube. So, and then, what is, have a purpose for the show.
Yep.
Who's your audience? What do you want to talk about? Who are the right guests? And, until that there's new podcasts coming down the pike pretty often.
Sure.
And Joyce Bosk posts a list of GovCon podcasts every year. She only lists 40 or 50. There's at least 150 now that I know of. You do a different kind of list. You do the best, and that's pretty cool. But, listen to a bunch of those before you get started and determine where you fit. Because if there's already 4 or 5 shows on procurement for contracting officers and for proposal people, are you going to be able to compete? I just wrote an article, I haven't published it yet, on influencers and what role do they play in the government market. Well, I was thinking about this. I think about weird shit like this all the time. Our conversations back at Hinge, right? Where do influencers fit in the government market? Well, the government market isn't, the world at large. We have no Swifties. There is no Taylor Swift here. Mm-hmm. There's no Roger Federer or Katie Ledecky here. So this is a market full of niches. So you can be a participant in a niche here. And it's just like being a visible expert. You're not going to be an expert across the board. You're going to be an expert for a particular community here. And if you find a community where you fit and where there is no current podcast, or maybe there's only one and you could do a different spin, you probably have found your niche. But, don't start a podcast assuming that everybody in the government market wants to listen to you. Building an audience, for a newsletter, for a blog, for a podcast, for yourself, building a network for yourself is an incremental process.
And that's so true, Mark. And I forget who I was interviewing. I think it was Scott McCain. I think at one point he said, podcasts are like on-demand radio for any topic that you want. And I think that kind of applies here, where in the government contracting market, there are so many different niches. There are so many different, agencies, and there are so many different, types of consulting work that government contractors can do. And I also think that, interviewing folks on a podcast is a great kind of step in a business development process and able to kind of nurture relationships. So if I was to add anything to what you said, Mark, it would be to maybe look at a podcast, not just as a marketing vehicle, but as a way to develop, relate, and build and deepen relationships with your target clients as well.
Yeah. I mean, look what you guys did at Hinge. You and Kelly put together this podcast, and Hinge helps companies and individuals build out that visible expert, subject matter expert platform. And you brought on all kinds of people that illustrated certain points of that process, right?
Right.
So, and that attracted business to Hinge. I was on a podcast just recently, I think it just aired, Leah the Brand from Merit Group. So it's my second time there with them. And Peter Jacobs and I have known each other 7 or 8 years now, and he's their podcaster. I die to have his voice. Authoritative, comes across really solid, but I'm stuck with this. But, we talk about brands, we talk about influencers, we talk about the marketing side of the market, and that's their niche. Well, building that subject matter expert, that visible expert, was Hinge's niche. So ad agencies can do this. I think more and more companies should consider doing it because, you take a company that's in cyber and let's say they're zero trust. So you've got some obvious players there and hosting a podcast where you can have government people come on your podcast, just like speaking at your event, but they don't have to leave their office to do it.
Exactly.
Or you can also interview your internal subject matter experts, because the more technical you are, the more likely it is you got some brainiacs in your shop that people should know about.
That's true.
So I don't want to encourage more podcasts because that'll dilute your audience and my audience.
Well, Mark, I contend that we are still very, very early in terms of podcasts kind of reaching peak saturation in the market.
Yep.
If you think about it, there are 600 million blogs on the internet. There's only 3.6 million podcasts, right? And then of those 3.6 million, only 8% are business podcasts. And then of that 8%, only 15% are actively publishing episodes. So simply by showing up consistently for a year, you're able. Chances are you'll be at a top podcast in your niche in 12 months.
Your stats are awesome, man.
I appreciate it. Well, this is my line of work, right? I got to know my numbers. But no, you bring up some great points, Mark. And I think that the podcasting is absolutely an opportunity for folks. I think you've shown that in the government contracting space. You've been pushing the envelope for decades. I just want to thank you so much for your time, Mark. Is there anything that we didn't talk about on this conversation that folks should know about?
No, but I do want to make one point. I walk every day. I'm not the youngest guy around, so walking's my exercise. Mm-hmm. So I'll plug in my earphones and I will queue up a podcast or two, and they're always business or B2G, and they're not mine. I don't listen to mine. I listen, I still listen to the one that I did with you and Kelly and Lee. And I don't listen to just me on shows. I want to hear what other people are saying. I want to hear how other hosts do things. There's a lot of really good ones out there. And I've listened to, probably a half a dozen of your episodes on my walks too.
I appreciate that, Mark.
Hey, I appreciate you doing this. And I especially appreciate you having me on.
Well, I think, you queuing up other podcasts and going on walks and thinking about how that can help you become a better host. I think that just speaks to how you operate in this learning and growth zone, and it's your track record that's been constant throughout your career. And so I think that's just really cool to see. And it's really cool to see how you've kind of spearheaded this, pushed marketing forward in the government contracting community. And that's just really cool to see. So, Mark, thank you so much for your time. And it's been an honor talking with you.
John, my pleasure, man. Thank you for the invite. Anytime.
Thank you so much for listening to my conversation with Mark Amtower. If you found this episode insightful, please leave a rating and review, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow along on LinkedIn. Happy podcasting.